Welcome to Brandwood CKC's February webinar, Nobody Complained, Post-Market Reporting under the Medical Device Regulations. My name is Belinda Dowsett and I'm the Quality Manager here at Brandwood CKC.
And I'm Hiam Kalla, a Senior Consultant in Medical Devices. Over the last few years, I have been involved with helping our clients understand the MDR requirements and the impact to their business.
So today we are going to discuss how good post-market surveillance and quality management system processes are key to your ongoing product evaluation and what this will look like in the wake of the MDR requirements. We will begin with a brief introduction to the changes under the medical device regulations. Next, we will take a look at the definition of post-market surveillance as defined by the MDR. We will then discuss the planning requirements for post-market surveillance and take a look at EUDAMED. Then we will move into a discussion on how quality management systems can be used to support post-market surveillance activities. And finally, we will summarise the risks associated with ineffective post-market surveillance and quality management system processes and what the solution is.
As many would know, there are significant changes happening in Europe, and most, if not all, revolve around the new Medical Device Regulations, or MDR. These will replace the Medical Device Directives, or MDD, as the new regulatory framework for medical devices. This slide outlines a summary of the changes under the MDR. Firstly, the introduction of general safety and performance requirements will replace the current essential requirements, and the upclassification of certain devices may mean more data is now needed to be generated to gain CE mark. Secondly, clinical evidence requirements have significantly strengthened, including a need for direct data. This and the increased scrutiny of data means stricter review processes. Finally, the changes to the post-market surveillance and the introduction of EUDAMED puts an emphasis on the continuous vigilance process, and this will be the focus of our conversation today. The MDR is scheduled to come into effect on the 26th of May 2020.
As Hiam pointed out, the new medical device regulations will strengthen the post-market surveillance requirements for manufacturers. The focus of the MDR is now much more on the process of post-market surveillance and vigilance, and it includes both the process of planning as well as the process of data collection, management and analysis. So we will take a look at how you can and should be using your quality management system to drive the post-market surveillance activities. So the planning under the MDR, so the medical device regulations now explicitly define the requirement for documented plans for the following activities: risk management, clinical evaluation, post-market surveillance and post-market clinical follow-up. The focus obviously being that if the initial planning is done correctly, then the outputs of the processes are more likely to address the MDR requirements and provide more value.
So Belinda, we often get questions about this. At around what stage in the product development process are you developing these plans?
Well, it will depend on the design and development process that is defined under the QMS, but they should be developed in the sequence that we've illustrated here, and they must be in place prior to executing the activities being defined. It should also be noted that these plans must be evolutionary, so that means they will change over time. And as you can see from this diagram, the plans are all interrelated. So the output of the post-market clinical follow-up is the post-market clinical follow-up report, which will form an input to the post-market surveillance plan. The post-market surveillance report will be used to update the clinical evaluation plan, and the clinical evaluation report will form an input to the risk management plan.
And what sort of factors would trigger an update to these plans?
Well, updates to these plans should be conducted on a periodic basis relative to the class of the device. But things such as changes in demographics and economics, any increase to device availability, for example, any new approvals in new markets, or as the data inputs increase or change, this may also trigger an update. So today we're going to be focusing on the last two plans in this series. What post-market surveillance actually is, and what are the new PMS reporting requirements under the MDR. So the MDR defines post-market surveillance as all activities carried out by manufacturers in cooperation with other economic operators to institute and keep up to date a systematic procedure to proactively collect and review experience gained from devices they place on the market, make available on the market, or put into service for the purpose of identifying any need to immediately apply any necessary corrective or preventive actions.
But this definition actually differs to what is defined under ISO 13485, which simply says it is a systematic process to collect and analyze experience gained from medical devices that have been placed on the market.
Yeah, that's right. And it's important to note that these definitions aren't conflicting. It's just that the MDR is providing a lot more detail and a clear focus on that proactivity and the follow-up activities, So the changes under the MDR are calling for a system that not only acts on complaints and vigilance reporting, but also on the proactive investigation and analysis of all possible data sources to promote timely action on potential issues. And it is for this reason that the planning, as we discussed in that previous slide, is essential. So we'll start with the post-market surveillance plan, and this plan must define at a minimum the methods, procedures and timelines for post-market surveillance. So the process must be systematic, proactive, effective and appropriate, and the data that it produces must be clear, organised, readily searchable and unambiguous. So this plan must give you the information on the collection of the information, the assessment of that data, including any indicators or thresholds, values for risk analysis and risk management, any details on the characterisation of the performance of the device, comparisons to similar devices, any investigations on complaints that have been reported, analysis of any market-related experiences, for example, any communication that's been had with the competent authorities, notified bodies, economic operators and users. This might include any incident reports or trend reporting, field safety corrective actions. You'll also be including data on any CAPA, corrective preventive actions. And the plan must also give the details on what's going to be required in the post-market surveillance report and the periodic safety update report, which we will discuss later. The final thing it should include is details on the post-market clinical follow-up or a justification for why the post-market clinical follow-up is not applicable for this device.
So software as a medical device is an emerging technology and something of a hot topic right now. How do the requirements for post-market surveillance planning differ for software?
So the requirements for post-market surveillance, they remain fundamentally the same across all classes and types of medical devices. But for software as a medical device, there'll be inherent differences to the way in which the data is collected. So for example, you may have a cloud-based software device and the data may come from the software's performance metrics, or you could even embed the feedback processes within the software itself. And it is these differences in the method of data collection that must be captured in the post-market surveillance plan.
One aspect of the post-market surveillance process is the post-market clinical follow-up, known as the PMCF. This refers to the active collection of data on clinical experience with your device after market release. PMCF is a continuous process that updates the clinical evaluation and needs to be addressed as part of your post-market surveillance plan. The PMCF is not mandated for all devices, however, it is a requirement for most, including innovative products, high-risk products, products that have undergone significant changes, as well as those that have achieved CE mark based on equivalence. To meet the MDR requirements, device manufacturers should design their PMCF activities with major goals in mind, including confirming the safety and performance of the device throughout its expected lifetime, identifying previously unknown side effects and monitoring the already identified side effects and contraindications, as well as ensuring the continued acceptability of the benefit-risk ratio. Similar to your post-market surveillance plan, the post-market clinical follow-up plan must be continuous, proactive, scheduled, and appropriate.
And when we say the word appropriate, what we mean is that it needs to be aligned with the classification of the device, as well as with consideration of the points we discussed in the previous slide. Things like, is it an innovative device, for example?
Yeah, that's right. The data to analyse as part of your PMCF shall include clinical experience, user feedback, assessment of literature, and the evaluation of clinical data relating to your equivalent devices. Therefore, the PMCF plan shall include at least the methods and procedures used to gather the clinical experience and feedback, rationale for the appropriateness of the methods and procedures used, as well as references to other parts of your documentation, such as clinical evaluation reports and risk management, as well as harmonised standards. It must be detailed and have a justified time schedule for these PMCF activities.
So we've covered what needs to be included in the planning stage, but let's now look at the sorts of post-market surveillance activities that provide the required outputs. So the PMS activities, as I've got written here on this slide, will include things like vigilance processes. So information on serious incidents, including information from periodic safety update reports and field safety corrective actions. An activity such as trending will provide you with trend reports, for example, trending of parts replaced in medical device servicing activities. The feedback and the complaints process, which will include the identification, investigation and definition of corrective actions relative to that feedback. And the outputs will include a report of the complaint data provided by users, distributors and importers. You'll have some clinical feedback, and this could include feedback received directly from healthcare professionals, or it could be received from sales or clinical representatives who may be present during the use of the medical device in question. The literature and the database and registry reviews. So this data is particularly valuable for devices such as joint replacements, where there is a wealth of information available on the register. So the analysis of registry data allows manufacturers to compare the performance of the device against comparator devices and identify areas for improvement or any early warning signs of a potential issue. And finally, we have the review of similar medical devices. So one part of this would obviously be the comparison of the registry data as just discussed, but you may also look at any other additionally publicly available information that may be available to compare with the subject device. Things such as materials used, designs, intended use, etc. And then all of this information is then summarised in a post-market surveillance report. So a post-market surveillance report is required for Class 1 devices, and it must include the results and conclusions of any post-market surveillance data gathered as a result of the PMS plan, and any rationale and description for any preventive or corrective actions taken relative to the device. So the post-market surveillance report is intended to be a live document. It will evolve over time as new data becomes available. However, the regulations do not define a frequency for this review. So this is what is required for a Class 1 device. But for devices with a higher classification, there are additional requirements including post-market clinical follow-up activities, which Hayden will discuss with you now.
That's right. So for devices above a Class 1, you will also be required to complete a post-market clinical follow-up report that analyses the information from these data sources, so your clinical experience, your feedback, scientific literature, as well as your PMCF studies. It should be noted there is no defined timeline in the regulations for updates to the post-market clinical follow-up activities, but as a general rule, it should be updated in line with updates to your clinical evaluation report. For example, for high-risk devices with an annual CER update, the post-market clinical follow-up will also be updated annually. This report will then form an input to the periodic safety update report. The PSUR is a more detailed post-market surveillance report for higher classification devices.
As Ian mentioned, the periodic safety update report is required for moderate and high-risk devices, that is Class 2A, Class 2B and Class 3 devices. The report is intended to be a live document that will evolve over time to include the results and the conclusions of post-market surveillance analyses, a summary of the post-market clinical follow-up findings, details of any corrective or preventive actions, a determination on the benefit to risk ratio, details of any changes to the device or processes, and the volume of sales of the device with an estimate evaluation of size and target population and, where practicable, the usage frequency of the device.
Belinda, can you explain a bit more about what you mean about the PSUR being a live document?
Well, what I mean is that the content of the document will not be static. It's not the kind of report that you write once and forget about. So many things will change over the lifetime of a device, and a report you write at the beginning of the device's lifetime will hold little relevance years down the track. In the beginning, you probably won't have data or inputs from each of the data sources we've highlighted here. For example, you are unlikely to have any corrective or preventive action data or any product design or process changes to include. And in a similar way, the content of your post-market surveillance analysis and post-market clinical follow-up findings that we discussed previously are constantly evolving. So these will affect the content of your periodic safety update report. So as the new data is generated, this needs to be fed back into your post-market surveillance systems to be captured in future updates to this periodic safety update report.
And I think that really provides the rationale behind why the regulations have mandated the frequency of updates for these reports.
Exactly, and I think this leads into what we wanted to discuss next, and that is EUDAMED.
So the European Database on Medical Devices, known as EUDAMED, will provide a central repository for information on medical devices. It actually currently exists, but its access is very restricted, and the information on there is not as detailed as it will be. The new database will be a multi-purpose and a multi-module database and include information on registration, unique device identifiers, notified bodies and certificates, vigilance, clinical investigations, and performance studies, as well as market surveillance. Its systems will function as a registration system, as a collaboration system, as a notification system, and the data that will feed into this will be provided by member states, notified bodies, economic operators, manufacturers, and sponsors. There will also be a component open to the public. The purpose of this new and improved EUDAMED is to provide transparency, protect public health, and really enable patients and healthcare providers to make informed decisions. The hope is that this will allow a build back of confidence in the regulatory system, which may have decreased in recent history. Initially due for release in March of this year, it is now scheduled for launch in May 2022.
So we've covered off the required planning and activities for post-market surveillance, but the next big question is, where does all this data come from? So the short answer is that it comes from the quality management system. And as we know, the QMS consists of the following subsystems. QMS management, which includes things like management responsibility, management and controls, management review, document and records control and audits, resource management, which includes infrastructure and environment and human resources, product realization and development, which is your customer related processes, design controls and some of your regulatory processes as well, the production and post-production processes, which is your non-conformance reporting, your purchasing and vendor controls, servicing and support activities and complaints handling. And finally, we have the measurement, analysis and improvement processes, which includes your CAPA, your corrective or preventive actions, and vigilance reporting as well. And you will find that throughout the post-market surveillance process that you will touch on most, if not all, of these subsystems. For example, your design control process will capture any product design changes. The servicing and support process will provide data on any out-of-box failures, equipment breakdown, or service and support requests. And arguably, I suppose, the most important is your complaints handling and vigilance processes. So any QMS procedures with a link to the generation or evaluation of product performance data must be linked to your post-market surveillance process. So I think looking at the QMS from that perspective, it's clear to see that it is vitally important that you have a functioning, effective QMS to assist in the generation and maintenance of that post-market surveillance data.
Belinda, when you say quality management system, are you referring to a specific system? Does it make a difference whether it's an MDSAP or ISO 13485 certified quality management system?
I think not at all. The fundamental requirements of an MDSAP or ISO 13485 quality system will each provide the foundations for an effective QMS, and obviously just with those jurisdictional nuances. And I think that's where the planning aspect really comes into it. In the same way the medical device regulations require you to plan your post-market surveillance activities, both MDSAP and ISO 13485 require you to plan your quality management system to fit the purpose defined by the organisation. And one of those purposes is obviously for the generation and maintenance of that post-market surveillance data. So if we take a look at the post-market surveillance process, you'll find data from each of the following sources. The graph, while not representative of all devices, shows how you may find more data from one source than another, and the distribution of data across these sources will be unique for each device. The type of device and the clinical use will be the biggest factors in determining the distribution of data sources. For example, where the device is often used under the supervision or guidance of an organisation's sales representative or clinical educator, you may find more data is generated from clinical feedback. Or for joint replacements where data is input to a national registry, there will be more data available from registries, especially on comparator devices. And for established devices where there is an extensive history of use and clinical acceptance, less of the data will be available from complaints and more from trending or internal review processes.
And I think the other important thing to note here is that analysing the sources of your data can actually provide you with another insight into the performance of your post-market surveillance processes. So if you start seeing that all your post-market surveillance data is being generated from complaints, then maybe your post-market surveillance process isn't quite as proactive as it should be. In an ideal situation, you would like to see all your data being generated from things like clinical feedback, registry data, and trending data.
So let's look at some of the risks to the post-market surveillance process associated with deficient or ineffective quality management systems. So if you do not have a functional, effective QMS integrated with your post-market surveillance program, you run the risk of being reactive. Your post-market surveillance process should act as an early warning sign to prevent the occurrence of more serious issues, adverse events, or field safety corrective actions. And as Ian mentioned, when most of the data for your PMS is coming from customer complaints, this could be the sign of a reactive post-market surveillance system. The next problem you may have is the availability of sufficient and meaningful data. If your QMS and your PMS are not effectively integrated, it won't matter how much post-market surveillance you conduct if there are no records being maintained in the document control system, or if there are no investigations conducted as part of the CAPA system. Next, you could run the risk of compromising the safety and efficacy of the device. So if you do not effectively identify post-market issues, including scoping the problem correctly, you run the risk of having defective or ineffective product available in the market, which will likely have flow-on effects to the perception and performance of the organisation as a whole. And obviously the biggest risk here is non-compliance. So now that we know the risks, let's take a look at some of the answers. What you need is an effective risk-based quality management system that is defined and unambiguous, so no grey areas, no room for error. You need a system that is process-based rather than driven by documentation or a need to generate records for the sake of records. You need the system to be easy to use and to promote engagement. It needs to be self-regulating, it should drive users through the process, and as a result, the required data or records will be automatically generated by the nature of the process. It will need to be timely and it needs to drive improvement. So it requires users to continuously review processes and data to identify those improvements. And you need a defined post-market surveillance plan that is integrated into the quality management system and is dynamic and continuous. So that brings us to the end of today's webinar. We hope you found the session informative, but if you have any further questions, we would love to hear from you. Please send them through to help@brandwoodckc.com.